Hey everyone, that's our second presentation. This is the case briefing. This is Kelly.
And this is Jennifer, and we're going to cover an animal case, as you saw in our listing. The caption for our case is W.E. Overby W.B. Overby, the petitioner plaintiff versus G.E. Poteet, the respondent defendant. This case was heard in the Supreme Court of Tennessee on February, or the ruling was issued on February the 5th, 1960. The Westlaw citation, as you see here, is Overby v. Poteet, 332 Southwest 2nd, 197, Tennessee 1960, or Tennessee Supreme Court. And there's a hyperlink for the case. We put it separate because then it looks like the whole thing is underlined. The facts of our case are that Mr. Poteet owns a farm up in Williamson County on a road that leads to Nashville. The farm's pasture is enclosed by some well-maintained fencing. It's 46 inches high, made up of woven wire with a strand of barbed wire along the top. It's standard fencing, cattle fencing, that he's used for 14 years to enclose his pasture. And he's only experienced 3 to 4 times in that 14 years that his cattle were able to get through the fencing, and his fence posts are all in good shape. Mr. Poteet's steer broke through the pasture fencing and entered the highway. The steer weighed about 1,200 pounds. And the plaintiff, Mr. Overby, was driving on Hillsborough Road at night on December the 15th when he collided with the defendant's wayward steer. The steer was neither vicious nor did it need special attention. The defendant did not know that the steer had broken out until he heard about the accident. The defendant did acknowledge that the steer did break through the fence, and he acknowledged that no fencing could hold a large steer if the steer wanted to go through it. The defendant, Mr. Poteet, prevailed, or he won in cases filed against him in succession by Mr. Overby in the Sessions Court of Williamson County, that's missing a Y there, the Circuit Court of Williamson County, and the Court of Appeals. And I'm just bringing this note out because we talked about the synopsis here. If you look at the synopsis in Westlaw, this case, it says it was that the plaintiff brought suit in the Chancery Court for Williamson County, while the opinion states that it was in the Circuit Court. And I went ahead and looked at Justia and Legal, and they both say it was in the Circuit Court as well. So we talked about that there could be errors in the synopsis. So I think this is an error in the synopsis in this case. The plaintiff brought certiorari, or he asked the Supreme Court to consider his case. The procedural history in this case, as you see Judge LeBron over here saying that the Sessions Court of Williamson County entered judgment in favor of the defendant. I'll get over in a minute. The Circuit Court, there was no jury, so the Circuit Court judge filed a memorandum that the defendant was not actionably negligent, and that the plaintiff was guilty of contributory negligence. So those are hyperlinks. If you wanted to go and look at what actionable negligence and contributory negligence are, but it's pretty much that the defendant that was not guilty of anything that would result in being able to file a lawsuit against him, and that the plaintiff was as guilty of being negligent. And the Court of Appeals affirmed the judgment of the Circuit Court, and then in this opinion, the Supreme Court granted certiorari and agreed to look at the case, and there is no subsequent history for this case. So the issue number one in this case is, did the defendant have fences encompassing his pasture that were sufficient to retain the livestock they held. The holding, the court affirmed the lower court's ruling that the defendant did have a lawful fence under the definition of what the fence was, and they went on to add that the fence used by the defendant was ordinary fencing. The rule of law in this case, we're going to see there's a couple, but the first one was the statute, which was 1702, where it talks about what materials are sufficient for fencing and gives the definition of what sufficient fencing is. But the court also went on to use the Wilson versus White case, which talks about the fact that the type of fencing the defendant used was standard or ordinary fencing. First of all, the court found that they should tell us that the facts were not disputed in this case, and that they are only looking at the conclusions of law. They applied the law that they had. The statute was applied as to whether the fencing was sufficient to restrain the livestock. The court used the statute as it relates to materials for fencing to determine that the defendant met the standard of a lawful fence as defined by the statute, and went on to use the Wilson case, to say that the fence was not only lawful, but that it was an ordinary fence as generally used to restrain that kind of livestock. That 3 is the page number. This information is in our printed case.
Issue number 2 is, did the defendant exercise ordinary care in maintaining his fences and in his own effort to keep the livestock in the fences? As you can see, ordinary care is also a hyperlink if you wanted it to see what the definition of ordinary care is. The holding in this case is that the court affirmed the judgment of the Court of Appeals and hold that TCA 44-1401 makes the owner of escaping animals liable only where he knowingly or negligently permits their escape. Hence, the first 2 assignments were overruled. The rule of law is the TCA 44-1401, the rights and duties of owners, the statute making it unlawful for the owner to willfully allow his livestock to run at large was designed to cover both the private property of others as well as highways, and the purpose was to prevent domestic animals from straying anywhere on account of the negligence or willful conduct of the owner. Under the statute, the owner of escaping animals is liable only where he knowingly or negligently permits their escape. And in the injuries by animals at large, the owner of the escaping animals is not liable if without his fault the animals have escaped from a pasture enclosed by lawful fence or by an ordinary fence such as is generally required to restrain that kind of livestock. For the application, the rule is not one of absolute liability, but depends upon failure to exercise reasonable care to confine or otherwise control the animal, and secondly, that the harm is of a sort which is normal for animals of its class to do. Mr. Petit did exercise ordinary care in making sure his fencing was in the proper place, height, and that the maintenance of the fence was maintained. Issue number 3 was the plaintiff guilty of contributory negligence? Excuse me there. And that one's also a hyperlink. The holding is that the court held in this case that as it was determined the defendant was not guilty of any negligence. There was no necessity in discussing contributory negligence on the part of the plaintiff. Therefore, there is no rule of law application to discuss on this one. The judgment on this case was the Tennessee Supreme Court affirmed the ruling of the Court of Appeals. This opinion was written by Justice Swepson, and there is no record of concurrences or dissents for this opinion. We hope that you enjoyed our presentation. And thank you so much for listening.
Have a great rest of the week. Bye, guys.